What is your earliest memory? I went home last week and did something I've done there since I was a child. My grandparents live on the Connecticut coast, far away from the light pollution that obscures the stars in urban centers like our city. It's so clear you can see our place in the Milky Way with the naked eye. This beautiful, cloudy, luminous band that arcs from one end of the horizon to the other. This year, as I gazed up, I was suddenly starstruck. All the noise of the world just hushed. No concerning headlines, no anxiety about an uncertain future, no social media guilting me for not logging in. When did that become a thing? Jude, you haven't logged into Facebook for 3 hours. I know. Have you been creeping on me for 3 hours? No email. God, what a blessing that was. You know you've unplugged when you can no longer think about your email. No viral variant that sounds like a Transformers villain. Omicron. Really? They couldn't have skipped that letter in the Greek alphabet? Surrounded only by the speechless night, cold and dark, very dark. It could have felt desolate, but it didn't. I found it oddly comforting. As I stood there alone, my eyes fixed on heaven, I didn't feel alone at all. I felt alive, so completely alive, lost in a silent symphony so real, so vast, so free, I could not contain it. But it contained me, as it had my mother, as it had her Lord, as it had David and Abraham and Elizabeth and Mary, as it had generations more numerous than the stars who each in their turn turned their gaze toward the star-dappled night. One star cluster in particular caught my eye. I remembered learning in elementary school about the Pleiades, or seven sisters. Perhaps you learned about them as well. We often confuse it with the Little Dipper. They were crucial to the Algonquin peoples who called Connecticut their home long before European colonizers landed on those shores. The Pleiades, speeding across the night sky, marked the onset of winter, a crucial time for maize cultivation. And staring up at that celestial field, I wondered what it might have been like for them to see those brilliant twinkling lights breaching the boundary of the eastern sky on a pristine winter evening. Something inside me leaped with a quickening of life. I could breathe. I could dream. I could imagine what it was like. I joined, however briefly, the great family of things, as Mary Oliver puts it. A shudder passed through me. One of those full-body, head-to-toe shudders where you sense that you've stepped from this world into a spiritually transparent one, where even if the meaning of everything isn't obvious, it doesn't matter, because you feel it intuitively, deeply in your bones. And why not? Our story is written in the stars, after all. So say Ray and Barnaby Norris in their paper, Why Are There Seven Sisters? A deceptively simple title that belies a quest for meaning as old as time. The two astrophysicists noticed something strange. Cultures as far apart as ancient Greece and the First Nations in Australia share an uncommonly common explanation for the disappearance of a seventh star in the Pleiades constellation. Today, if you look up, for most people, only 6 stars are visible to the naked eye. But indeed, the constellation is composed of 7 to 9 primary stars, which, under the right conditions, are visible. Both cultures share similar stories, where the constellation called Orion is identified as a hunter or a group of young men. And both cultures imagine Orion attempting to catch or violate the young girls who are the Pleiades. In the Greek myth, Zeus transforms the girls into a star to spare them this fate. But how could this be? Anthropology, population genetics, and archaeology suggest that Australia's First Nations arrived about 50 to 70,000 years ago and had virtually no contact with other cultures for the intervening time till the British invaded in 1788. They surmise that the story of the seven sisters may be the oldest known story in the world, that the reason such faraway cultures share a similar memory of a seven-sister star is because about 100,000 years ago, around the time that modern humans were migrating from Africa, Pleione was visibly distinct from Atlas. People as geographically and culturally different as ancient Greeks and Australians' First Nations shared this ancient memory of the night sky. And why did this story go viral? Why were we so excited to learn of such disparate people sharing the same or a very similar story? I think it had something to do with the spirit of division and rancor and suspicion that seems to pervade our society and our world at the moment. What if we have more in common than we know? That's the question this very simple cross-cultural analysis puts to us. It's also the question that our gospel puts to us. To be sure, our story has its origins in the physical stars, but the stars have an origin story too. Long before they were embryonic lights in foggy nebulae, another light, far brighter than any they will ever produce, gave birth to all that we see and know and touch and feel, all that we love and cherish in this world. I enjoy a good horoscope as much as the next person, and I am a consummate Pisces. My poor colleagues can attest, I am truly a Pisces. But Christians tell a different story from the rather sometimes deterministic one of ancient astral interpretation. Our story is written in the stars, but it is not written by the stars. It is written by a far more ancient light. Listen closely. John's gospel doesn't begin with a reference to Jesus of Nazareth the way other gospels do. Even very good Bible scholars and theologians sometimes miss the full meaning of this. They simply assume that the two are synonymous, but they're not exactly. It begins instead with a reference to the Word, the divine principle at work ordering the whole cosmos according to ancient Greek philosophy. John's gospel reminds us that as ancient as the dynastic, legal, and prophetic stories of Scripture may be, there is a more ancient story still. Frankly, I'm surprised more Christians aren't offended by it. John is crystal clear. The Word is the light of all people, not just some people, not just Christians. Jesus of Nazareth is the Word made flesh, but that Word is not exhausted in him. Jesus reveals and embodies the Word, but it also extends in, through, and even beyond him. The Word which brought all creation into being is also present to and through that very creation, has been for billions of years before it took flesh in the person of Jesus, and was present to and through our ancestors as they migrated from the African continent. Albeit not always in obvious ways and heavily obscured by the polluting presence of our many false lights. Hence the need for a little clarification in the incarnation. But John wants us to go back to the very beginning, even before humans were around at all. In the beginning. If Genesis is the story of the human family turning on each other, being expelled from a single home, fracturing across lands, kingdoms, and identities, forgetting their common origin, neglecting their roots in God, and all that that implies, then John is inviting us all to remember, literally, to remember. Remember our most ancient story. Remember our origins, not in flesh and blood, but in God. That's how John tells us we are remembered into this new family of God. That's the kind of children we become when we embrace the true light coming into the world. But that requires us letting go of our tribalisms, letting go of our claims of superiority and privilege, letting go of our pettiness, competition, and greed, letting go of all that stands between us and the light. Last night, both the dean and the bishop reminded us that Jesus, this Word who brought and brings everyone into being, invites people to the table whom many would consider unfit or unqualified from the outside or even from other religions. A Roman centurion, a Samaritan, a Syrophoenician woman. The Word brought all people into being and sustains us all. Just as God cannot be divided, neither can God's grace and truth be divided. There isn't a Hindu love versus a Christian love. There is just love. There isn't a Buddhist justice versus a Jewish justice. There is just justice. There isn't an atheist generosity versus a believer generosity. There is simply generosity. All people come from the light, and all people may testify to that light. Our Hebrews reading says that the Son is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. We may not all be the exact imprint, but we are all made in the image of that same being. However imperfectly we may express it, we cannot help but express it. How wonderful is that? We cannot help but manifest something of God's very being. It's who we are. Yes, be sober. Advent reminds us in the starkest terms to keep awake, but our wakefulness should be more than mere alertness. Our wakefulness should be felt by others as a light of God warming the world around us. We are awake not only to wait for God's coming, but to proclaim it, to live it, to embody it here and now. The kingdom is among you, is within you. The church, not a club for God's chosen people to congratulate themselves on being God's favorites, nor a place to feel smug about being better than others. Christmas is perhaps the most unchristian of holidays. Most holidays remind the people celebrating it that they are special, but in this one we remember just the opposite, and actually that's even more special. Humility and service mark out the incarnation at every turn. Mild he lays his glory by. In this same gospel, Jesus bends the knee to wash his disciples' feet and commands them to do the same. The church ought always to have a bended knee toward the world, to be a people who remind everyone else of what it is like to remember that we truly are all family, those we think are worthy and those we think are not, those who profess Christ and those who don't. Professing Christ doesn't mean that we're better. It means we have a special obligation to treat others with such love that they catch this fire, this holy yearning to see a whole world transformed in the light of God's immeasurable favor and goodness, to believe in a world that is full of grace. As the fog of uncertainty rolls in, Omicron, climate change, geopolitics, we will be tempted to embrace a nearsighted approach to our lives and our futures. But it is precisely in moments like these that we must cast a longer and larger vision. John may speak of division, but it is a lament over the unnecessary, not a concession to the inevitable. His prologue is urging us to lift our eyes above all that divides and diminishes us, to remember and to believe in that most ancient of stories, to know in our bones that we too are perched on the lap of the Father, of a God who loves us beyond our wildest imaginings, who wants so desperately for us to know that love and to learn that love toward one another. We who profess that Christ is the true light entering the world must also pray that we have grace to live our lives each day as though that were actually true. As we turn our faces toward the night sky vaulting over us, we are invited to remember how our ancestors long ago set their sights on those same stars, to remember that the human family in its truest form isn't born from violence, but of the harmonious constellation of the stars in a single symphony of hope, faith, and love. Our origin isn't just in the light, our origin just is the light. Let those with ears to hear, hear. There is a fire, invisible, quietly crackling at the heart of being itself, giving light and light to all things, rising, even this morning, with healing in his wings.